and the economic well-being in a region, but it would be a wrong inference to say that it is also individual Protestants in the regions who are responsible for the higher well-being. Why? Because it could be that it is the Catholic individuals in these regions that ultimately make the difference. Micro individual data are the answer to cope with ecological fallacy problems, something that Weber didn't do. So missing micro foundations are a methodological problem here. Then Brentano already here in 1916 made the point that Catholicism is a little bit underappreciated. There are also Catholic spirits that were available at the time. So think also about the early capitalist cities in Catholic Italy, where the merchant capitalism probably was born in the West. Misrepresentation also perhaps of capitalism. So these were more, let's say, verbal critiques that draw on just anecdotic kind of counterexamples. There are also a couple of more modern quantitative tests that I wanted to mention. One very interesting one is about the claim that it's actually the inverse causality. So that it's not Protestants that basically became rich, but that it's rather rich cities that opted for Protestantism during the Reformation and after to free themselves from Catholic rule. Because if you still pertain to the Catholic Church, then these non-secular cities had to pay a certain tribute to the Catholic Church and were economically more dependent when compared to choosing this new Protestantist religion. And when you look at the cities, the most prosperous cities after the Reformation, then they were mostly Protestant. And Cantoni also uses quantitative data to underscore this point. Then you already saw the figures collected by Becker-Wössmann, whose data, by the way, you can freely download also from the IFO, the IFO Institute website in Munich. And they use these figures to make this interesting point that it may not, so that Weber was probably right about the correlation, but that his micro-mechanism about the religious work ethic being the decisive factor explaining the macro trend may not be correct, and that it is instead human capital through schooling. Why? Because in Protestant schools with this tradition of Bible reading in the native languages, literacy and numeracy were much more widespread. So in economics terms, that is, investment in human capital was much more widespread. And it was then rather human capital and not the religious work ethic which made the Protestant regions more prosperous. This explanation was very recently also criticized by some economists here at the Humboldt University in Berlin, who show that the finding by Becker-Wössmann in turn is also flawed because they do not distinguish between the different Catholic groups, most importantly not between the Catholic natives and the poor Catholic immigrants to the German Empire, mostly coming from Poland. And when you do control for these different immigrant groups, then what seems to be the Protestant effect is largely driven by certain Catholic immigrant groups just being poor. So it's rather a question of poor immigration and not so much about religion and schooling. An interesting background condition you have to keep in mind when interpreting also this finding is that Weber himself came from a Pietist family. He was not himself a practicing Protestant, but he had that background and mindset at a time when in the 1870s in the German Empire there was the so-called culture war going on. So mainly the Protestant-dominated German nation against the Catholic Pope, who could count on, in Prussia, roughly a third of Catholic population. And there was a certain, let's say, power struggle between the Pope and his doctrines and the Protestant German state, which led to a certain stigmatization of the Catholic minority. And when you take this kind of a background, then you can imagine that the bashing of Catholics was something, I mean, also culturally happening at the time. And Weber might not have been completely free of, let's say, a certain prejudices dominant among the Protestant ruling elite at the time. So yeah, important background condition to keep in mind. Okay, so this was a brief summary of where the Protestant ethics is nowadays. I mentioned earlier that Weber did not consider at the end of his life the Protestant ethic as an isolated piece, but as one element in a much broader sociology of religion. So Weber in the sociology of religion had this huge plan and executed most of it actually of replicating his analysis of Christianity and Protestantism and its economic effects on capitalism for the other major world religions. And so he did this with Judaism, with the Islamic world, but yes, also with Taoism and Confucianism in East Asia. Yeah? And by doing this, Weber aimed at large historical comparative sociology of how religious beliefs impacted then economic life. And he founded at the same time a debate that nowadays is referred to as the Great Divergence, based on Kenneth Pomeranz's book here of the same title, which mainly starts from this graph again here as the main puzzle, which shows again the GDP development here using a log scale to make it better visible. In this very long run, right, you saw this already, the Malthusian cycles here, not much going on, up until the 17th century when there was the economic takeoff in some Western countries here, the Anglophone countries, Great Britain starting, then US following, taking over, but also early industrial France and Germany being also the economically backward countries until the 20th century. And contrast this here with the Chinese development, which even goes down from 1700 onwards and only has seen this recent catch-up process of the late to the 20th century up to the current day with convergence, slow convergence of per capita GDP levels. So there are different hypotheses about what causes this great divergence, which describes this initial gap here between the East and the West. And one prominent hypothesis in the account is obviously that European colonialization was crucial in bringing the Chinese curve down here, right, in the 19th century, forcing the Opium Wars on China losing population, losing economic power, so that the two developments were obviously not disconnected. So for a very long time, the West didn't really